is Weather or Not.
All right, welcome into Weather or Not. I'm WNBF First Alert Chief Meteorologist Jamie Arnold, and we're creeping our way towards the end of hurricane season.
Yeah, and of course, while we creep toward the end, there's still a lot of recovery efforts that are ongoing from some of the storms, but we figured why not go with a little history lesson today, kind of dust off our memory too. While it hasn't been the most active season compared to what was forecast.
As far as numbers.
As far as numbers, still just as active when it comes to impacts.
Yeah, an important point that it never really matters how many storms form. It's all about where they go, and that was a very important lesson learned so far this hurricane season. Let's jump right into it with the first part of the season. Here's a fun fact. ABC, Alberto, Beryl, Chris, the first three storms of this hurricane season, all managed to hit land.
Yeah, and how about Chris? Once again, short-lived. Most people don't remember it.
Poor little Chris, over a weekend.
It was a span of about 5 hours.
About a 5-hour tropical storm.
Alberto, obviously June 20th, but Beryl kind of stole the headlines there in early July. In fact, let's go ahead and show you the numbers here of Beryl. Hurricane Beryl was the first major storm of the 2024 hurricane season. It was the first ever Category 4, Jamie, for June on record.
And then we flip the calendar into July. It was a Category 5 hurricane on July 2nd, marking the earliest on record that we've seen a Category 5 in the Atlantic. Also, the most tornado warnings ever produced in a single day, as we saw Beryl's remnants work its way into parts of Texas and Louisiana. 165 mile-per-hour sustained winds at its peak.
Yeah, one of the big things with Beryl, if you remember, was the rapid intensification window in 24 hours. 63 mile-per-hour increase in those winds, going from that low-end hurricane, quotation on that, to what was a strong Category 5.
Yeah, so we'll go from Beryl and Chris into the D-named storm, and that was the first time the Carolinas got involved with issues. Of course, Debbie initially made landfall on August 5th there in the Florida Big Bend area, Steinhatchee, Crystal River, that area. It was a big event as far as flooding and storm surge. Even though it was a Category 1 hurricane, still managed to cause some big issues there.
Yeah, you're taking a look at Sarasota County, you can see all the rain. That was a big concern. And at the time, you know, we're over here thinking, okay, they're having a pretty bad time in the Big Bend region, and we didn't even know what was coming. In fact, let's talk about even locally what happened with us. We saw some of the rivers start to rise. If you flash forward or fast forward back to this, yeah, this is the Lumber River and also in Conway where those river levels started to rise. We talked about this on Are You Serious? When you live in an area like this, Jamie, you get a lot of tropical rain. This is bound to happen.
Yeah, there were big fears with Debbie that some of the rainfall, at least locally, could rival some of what we saw back from Florence. We didn't quite get there, at least in our area, but other parts of the state did certainly pick up on some extremely impressive rainfall totals. Let's go back and look at those totals that we saw from Debbie. Loris, at least locally, that is the hot spot, coming in with 16 1/3 inches of rain, over 15 inches in North Myrtle Beach. Look at Calabash and Little River, both coming in at 14.5, 13.25 inches of rainfall.
Of course, from Debbie, we continued with Ernesto. Let's go ahead and show you how that looks. Ernesto, once again, stayed out there but made landfall in Bermuda. That was on August 17th as a Category 1 hurricane. Also, you go from Ernesto to Francine. Notice Gordon stayed well out there to the Atlantic, but Francine on September 11th this year made a landfall as a Category 2. That was once again, and we have some video of that where you can see damage from that Category 2 hurricane as we were going through. We got to redo that.
But you saw me making that awful face. Do we start from the beginning? So we're starting over? Okay.
This is Weather or Not.
And welcome into this edition of Weather or Not. We are now in November and kind of taking a look back at what we've seen so far out of this very active hurricane season as we slowly close in finally on the end of it.
Yeah, kind of dusting off really some of the cobwebs and maybe the memory. I know for me, this was like, oh yeah, all this happened this year. Let's start with the ABCs here as we go after the storm. Alberto, Beryl, and Chris. The big story out of these, Chris was so short-lived. Alberto obviously in June, but it was Beryl. Beryl was that strong hurricane, Category 5. But first, it was the first ever Category 4 hurricane for June. Of course, then it became the earliest Category 5 hurricane just a couple days after July began, Jamie.
Yeah, July 2nd reached Category 5 intensity. Also produced the most tornado warnings ever produced in a single day across Texas and Louisiana, 115. Those peak winds reached 165 mile-per-hour winds. It was also another case of rapid intensification. We saw a 63 mile-per-hour increase in those wind speeds in just a 24 hours time with Beryl. After those, of course, we had Debbie. The first time the Carolinas got involved. The thing with Debbie, made landfall there in the Big Bend area of Florida, Steinhatchee, Crystal River, but it was kind of a big storm. A lot of rain producer thunderstorms associated with Debbie, all the way down to Sarasota dealing with some of that flooding.
It kind of felt like Debbie was the start of what we talked about, a lot of rain with these tropical systems, and really started to see some impacts like in the Big Bend region like Sarasota. But even here locally, that was the big story. You talked about it. We got rain and we even saw some river flooding when it came to that. That's when our rivers started to rise. You remember we were talking about all those river levels back there with Debbie, like the Lumber River, also in Conway. We even mentioned this on Are You Serious earlier this year. Yeah, this happens when you get that amount of rain, but still some issues for the folks that live near those rivers, Jamie.
Yeah, thankfully we didn't verify with some of those initial 20 to 25 inch forecasts that were coming out, but nonetheless, we still ended up with some really impressive rainfall totals around here. Loris was the winner, 16 1/3 inches of rain. North Myrtle Beach, 15 1/4, almost 15 in Kingstree, and down the list, 11 inches in Aner. Then Briarcliff Acres coming in at just over 9 inches of rain.
And we take from Debbie, let's go to the next name. How about Ernesto? You also have Francine and Gordon. Gordon, of course, basically just stayed out there. It was that tropical storm, but Ernesto made a landfall as a Category 1 on August 17th there in Bermuda. Francine, that one hit on September 11th with landfall. And if you remember that was a little bit more of some rapid intensification near September 11th and made landfall in Louisiana. We actually have some video of that. This, obviously, some big time wind.
Yeah, some big time wind there across coastal Louisiana. And if you're keeping track, A, B, C, D, E, F. The first 6 storms of the 24 season all hit land. It wasn't until we got Gordon that stayed out into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So yeah, 6 landfalls all the way up through August.
And of course, I think we all know what's coming next. That was one of the ones here, especially that was felt all the way into the Carolinas, and we're talking about Helene. Let's start in Florida first, though, because as we were talking about the Big Bend region a couple of months earlier, yeah, all eyes on the Big Bend as Florida once again was bracing for Helene, making landfall as a Category 4 on September 26th. And we talked about the fast speed of this and how the impacts would be felt so much further across the Carolinas as well, Jamie.
It went into very near the same place that Debbie went into as a Category 1 hurricane earlier in the season. But of course, not just the Florida impacts. Helene raced its way inland, and we ended up with the absolute catastrophe that happened across the Western Carolinas into Tennessee, the 28th into the 29th. Just absolutely catastrophic flooding, landslides, mudslides all across western North Carolina, the Tennessee border, extreme southern sections of Virginia, and the recovery continues there. We were just sort of sideswiped here locally by Helene, but we did pick up a lot of tornado warnings. If you were with us, you know it was a very busy morning that day with several confirmed tornadoes touching down. Most of those, thankfully, were on the weak side.
Yeah, we were talking about what we talk about, that dirty side on the right side of there as Helene was bringing all the rain across Georgia and even into portions of North Carolina. For us, it was the tornado warnings, and it was also the rainfall for some parts. Let's bring you to some of the Helene rainfall totals. Thankfully, we're not talking about significant rainfall in all the areas. When we talk about these tropical systems, we say double digits. Obviously, we can take it, but look at the difference between our area of 9 to 11, 12 inches in Socastee and Conway and Pawleys Island. And then look on the left side of your screen there, Jamie. Of course, we know up into North Carolina, 30 plus inches of rain, and that was all from a couple of days with that predecessor event.
Yeah, absolutely incredible rainfall totals there. Then we had Isaac, big one out there in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Kirk, Leslie, Joyce, thankfully all of those, that whole little cluster of hurricanes there, all thankfully managed to stay safely out over the Atlantic Ocean with no big issues. But then we get into Milton, the next big hurricane. Of course, that one was a huge fear for Florida. It made landfall as a Category 3 on October 9th near Siesta Key, Florida, but just 2 days prior, it had been a Category 5 hurricane there in the Gulf of Mexico. Thankfully, it did weaken a bit, but still weakening not really enough. Still a Category 3 again at landfall.
And of course, you'll remember Tropicana Field and just the roof there that was collapsed, the crane as well there in portions of Tampa. And we just saw all kinds of stuff come through with the night. But how about even after the storm, where the daylight started to reveal even more of the extent of damage coming in from Milton? And it wasn't just the wind when it came to Milton and the storm surge, but it was that unique tornado setup that really unfolded. We talked about Beryl and the tornado warnings and what it did. Little did we know we're going to go a couple months later and have 126 tornado warnings in Florida, the most there issued from the National Weather Service.
Yeah, the second most tornado warnings ever issued in a day, only behind the April 2011 tornado outbreak across the Deep South. Just incredible tornado outbreak there associated with Milton. Here locally, we were housing evacuees from both Milton and Helene at Darlington Raceway.
Yeah, Darlington Raceway opened up the shelters, which was awesome. And just to see the people in the Carolinas helping out people from Florida. And keep in mind, for some, this was the third hit in Florida. Others were just saying, when is it going to end? So to see other people reaching out after everything that happened, certainly a big story. So we go from Milton, then we continue with our alphabet down to Nadine. And if you remember, this was short-lived on October 19th. Yeah, Nadine made landfall in Belize. This is a tropical storm here. Nadine, of course, bringing just some tropical storm force winds and rain, but thankfully no significant impacts there in Belize.
And our final one so far would be Oscar. Oscar, an interesting little hurricane. It sort of escaped the models. It sort of escaped a lot of satellite detection. An incredibly tiny, short-lived little hurricane that did make landfall in Cuba on October 20th as a Category 1. Here's the thing, it has now officially been declared that Oscar is the tiniest hurricane on record in the Atlantic Ocean. Get this, hurricane force winds extended out 5 miles from the center.
This has just been one of the weirdest hurricane seasons, which is where we want to bring you back here as we continue on Whether or Not. With a forecast that was so aggressive with some of the storms forecast, but the impact so significant, well, where do we stand up on all that? First Alert meteorologist Jenna Greenhill has a look as we continue through hurricane season.
Well, the 2024 season is almost done. We are a month away from the hurricane season finishing. Colorado State releases their outlook in the beginning of hurricane season, calling for a well above average season. So far, we've had 15 named storms, 10 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes. In the beginning of the season, Colorado State called for 23 named storms, 11 hurricanes, and 5 major hurricanes. So for hurricanes and major hurricanes, we're kind of right along that track. However, we are seeing a little bit less of the named storms compared to what we originally may have thought. However, that doesn't discount the amount of impacts we've seen. A devastating and hurtful hurricane season we've already seen, and we are not done yet. We could still see something come out of the Atlantic in the next month. For Whether or Not, I'm meteorologist Jenna Greenhill.
All right, Jenna, thank you very much. And there were certainly some very interesting moments of the hurricane season so far. I'm trying to focus on the positive side.
Yeah, I like that.
This was definitely one of my favorite stories from the hurricane season. Check this out. the ashes of famed hurricane and radar meteorologist Peter Dodge were dropped into Category 5 Hurricane Milton as it was near its peak intensity over the Gulf of Mexico. That is the way to honor a longtime hurricane meteorologist. It's kind of the way I want to go now, I think.
I think that is.
Throw my ashes right out the back of an airplane.
And I think when you give so much to something, whether
Yeah.
it be hurricane season and flying into this to keep the public safe,
Yeah.
that's certainly a way to tribute. Let's continue the good.
Yes.
Obviously, it came from a tragedy, but let's talk about Concert for the Carolina, right? Of course, with the Helene in the western North Carolina, we were talking about how they need desperate help. And how was that going to happen? Well, let's get some country music singers together.
do it.
Let's do a huge lineup, and let's donate every dollar. $24.5 million raised going directly to the mountains in western North Carolina.
And I think what is amazing is the owners of Bank of America Stadium,
Yeah.
they not only said, we're going to give you the stadium, but then kind of at the last minute said, what we make from parking, what we make from beer sales, what we make from concessions, it's all going. 100% of it is going.
And I think, too, I saw a couple of people that posted to be in that building that night,
Yeah.
to feel the experience of the generosity. It's just, it had to be a night that I'm sure the artists, the people in there, and I know the people in western North Carolina are not going to forget. Let's take you to another See It, Snap It, Send It this time, though, and let's bring it back here to when we were doing tornado warnings, and we thought we were going to get close to having one on our tower cam.
You know, it was close. This is what we were watching very closely on September 27th as those outer bands of Helene were pushing through our area. One of the many rotating thunderstorms that blew its way on shore. You can see those low-hanging clouds there off in the distance, a couple of little fingers occasionally stretching down. That was a significant area of rotation, and again, likely pretty close to producing a tornado or a funnel cloud there. Thankfully, our tornadoes from Helene weren't overly damaging and were primarily over rural areas. If you capture anything in the weather world, we want to see it.
Yeah, see it, snap it, send it, scan this QR code. It'll download the WNBF First Alert Weather app. And if you go to the very bottom of the app, there's a link there to where you can send your favorite moments, whether it's up in the sky, maybe it's decorations or whatever you want to showcase. You never know. That's
Yeah.
why it's called Weather or Not. And I look forward to seeing whatever you send to us.
Yeah, it is certainly fantastic. That's going to do it here for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to Weather or Not. Remember, you can go back and check some of our other episodes on WNBFnews.com.
Yeah, y'all have a good one, and we'll talk to you soon.